Set in the Caribbean Sea, the story will focus on a family consisting of a father, mother, and 2 children who are on vacation on their private yacht. Julia, the mother, decided to swim in the sea alone without telling her husband and children, with the aim of enjoying the freshness of salty seawater and feel freedom in the midst of the natural beauty of the sea. When Tom, the father, and Ben, the youngest son, were busy fishing in the back of the boat, Julia suddenly felt a current of seawater that seemed to pull her away from the ship. Julia tries to scream for help, but since Tom and Ben are in the back and Cassie, her eldest, is engrossed in listening to music, Julia is completely helpless. Tom hears Julia screaming for help, so he hurries to the ship to save her. He jumped into the water to pull Julia onto the boat, and with a breathless breath, Julia was finally rescued from the strong ocean currents. After being brought on board, Julia told what she had experienced. As explained earlier, Julia admitted that she was carried away by the current of water which made her stay away from the ship. However, Tom and the children clearly do not feel anything strange, so Tom warns them all to never swim around before telling the others. In the evening, Tom and the family are seen celebrating Ben's 13th birthday, which is a holiday specifically intended to celebrate his birthday while strengthening family harmony. They really enjoyed the moment with lots of laughter and happiness. Before long, Cassie also got a call from her boyfriend who wanted to ask how and when to go home. Cassie was quite surprised when she saw the sky conditions there were very bad, to the point of causing the signal to be weak. After a video call with his girlfriend, the family is suddenly startled by a strange noise outside the ship, which, after being seen, turned out to be a swarm of whales swimming in groups heading in the same direction, and it is not known what caused it. One of the whales accidentally nudged the bottom of the ship, which resulted in the ship could not be moved, so the curious Tom decided to dive to make sure what happened. Upon returning to the surface, Tom suffered a laceration to the top of his arm. He claimed to have been hit by a ship's propeller after one whale appeared suddenly, but the worst part was that the propeller suffered severe damage, as well as the ship's engine, which meant that they had to be stuck in the middle of this ocean. Julia called for help via satellite radio, and Tom continued to try to start the ship, but apparently it was in vain because the propellers were not strong enough to move the ship. Not quite there, Tom and the family were again surprised by another strange phenomenon when celestial bodies fell from the sky, one of which almost hit their ship. After seeing the falling debris, Tom finally realized that it was not a meteor, but a satellite. Not knowing what really happened, Tom and his family were still panicking, even more panicked when the calm seawater instantly turned very violent. The compass suddenly spun irregularly, as if something were interfering with the Earth's magnetic field, followed by waves in high frequency that made them all bleed from the inside. The next morning, after the storm passed, Tom and his family woke up and looked around. They were surprised to see the very dirty condition of the ship, with fish and marine debris scattered on it. However, what surprised them the most was when they realized that their ship was now in an impossible place, as if the surrounding geography had changed dramatically. This situation made them all feel confused and couldn't believe what was happening. The water was gone, no one knew where. The compass doesn't work as well as it should. North denotes south, south denotes north, as if the poles were reversed, which, if it does happen, means that all the seawater in the ocean is not lost, but only moved into a land position. Realizing this state of affairs, Cassie immediately felt sad and lost hope. She remembered her boyfriend who was still on land, and the feeling of loss grew stronger. Because Cassie needed time alone to process her feelings, Julia, the mother, understood and made room for Cassie. Tom is still busy trying to fix his satellite radio for help. Meanwhile, Julia chooses to clean up the remaining food stocks so that they can last longer. On the other hand, Ben looks creative by using the balloons from last night's birthday to make an SOS sign, hoping that there are other survivors around them who can see it and provide help. Suddenly, Tom manages to connect with a surviving survivor via his satellite radio. The man claimed to be the captain of a scientific submarine that managed to survive the disaster overnight. The captain then explained that the seawater had moved to the mainland due to the phenomenon of polar reversal and the Earth's magnetism that was happening. This means that major changes to the planet have caused the seas to leave their places and flood the land, creating an unprecedented emergency situation. Based on the tools at his disposal, the captain predicts that the seawater will most likely return in about a week, which means that there will be some kind of tsunami on a very powerful scale. The captain suggests that Tom and the family go to great heights to avoid the disaster. Realizing that Tom and his family are far from the highlands, he considers joining the captain's submarine. However, the captain informed that the submarine is a small scientific submarine that can only accommodate 3 people, including himself. That is, there are only 2 places left available for Tom and his family. As parents who love their children, Tom and Julia resigned if they did not survive the disaster later. They just begged the captain to take their 2 children, Ben and Cassie, to join them in the submarine. After a moment of deliberation, the captain finally agrees to take Ben and Cassie into his submarine. He immediately gives Tom the coordinates of his submarine's location. Without wasting any more time, Tom and his family immediately packed up and prepared to head to the designated location point to meet the captain and his submarine. While Julia is packing, Tom accidentally sees a survivor and his pet dog. Most likely the survivor was a fisherman who could be seen from the fish spear he was carrying. Tom, who was happy to see that there were other survivors, went straight to him to just give him water to drink. Suddenly, the survivor attacks Tom after Tom gives him water to drink. Julia, who was always on the alert, immediately warned her 2 children to be careful. However, Cassie, who was busy listening to music a little late, realized her mother's warning. When Cassie finally realizes the situation, she immediately reacts quickly and opens the door for Dan to seek shelter, while Ben also panics at the sight of the incident. After closing all the doors, Julia immediately hid her children in a safe and different place to protect them. Meanwhile, he himself prepares to confront the survivors by using a kitchen knife as a means of defense. The survivor tried hard to get inside the ship, and finally he managed to break through the door. Upon entering, it becomes clear that the motive of the survivors is to take away the entire stock of food that Julia has. While eating, the survivor began to look for Julia throughout the room. However, Julia managed to get out of the ship and was attacked by the survivor's dog, which she was eventually forced to finish off. Julia jumped on board to save her 2 children. Determined to protect her children, Julia is prepared for this dangerous situation. The situation becomes very stressful when the survivor attacks the defenseless Julia. As the survivor strangles Julia, Cassie, who had previously been hiding under a chair, finally appears and points a flare gun at the survivor. Bravely, Cassie fires the flare gun, hoping to distract the survivors and give her mother a chance to escape or fight back. The flares ricocheted and set the ship on fire. Julia immediately kicked the survivor and took the children out of there. Seeing Tom, who was already lifeless, the children paid their last respects by hugging him. Meanwhile, the survivors managed to survive the fire of the ship. Without wasting any more time, Julia immediately took her children to escape from the location, to find a safer place and distance themselves from the survivors who still threatened their safety, according to the map coordinates that Julia had previously managed to save. They then proceeded to the captain's submarine. Because the body is exhausted, Julia and the children decided to rest for a while at the location of the cliff gap. There, Cassie had blamed the balloon that lured the survivors to come. This indirectly makes Ben feel very guilty because he is the one who installed the balloon. However, Julia immediately calms down and assures that their father's death has nothing to do with what Ben has done. After a long journey for hours on the bottom of the sea that is dried up, they suddenly stopped for a moment when they saw a shark lying helpless from dehydration. However, this moment does not last long as the survivor, who apparently still holds a grudge for the death of his pet dog, reappears in that place. With emotions running high, the survivors immediately went after them. Julia and her children immediately ran as fast as possible to keep away from the threat of survivors. For the second time, Julia and the children managed to escape from the survivor. They kept walking until they came to a location full of piles of plastic and decided to take a break again. Seeing Ben dehydrated, Julia quickly gave him water to drink. However, it turns out that Cassie admitted that she forgot to close the water container properly, so the stock of water they have now runs out. This leaves Julia feeling frustrated, as Cassie often does not admit her mistakes and instead allows others to face the consequences. Julia and the children returned to travel until they reached the location of the wreckage of the plane. Since it was getting dark, Julia decided to spend the night there. With the remaining stocks of food available, Julia asked her children to eat and fill their stomachs. However, in the midst of trying to survive, Julia and the children still cannot accept the fact that Tom, the father and head of the family they love so much, is no longer with them. This loss leaves a deep sorrow in their hearts, and this difficult situation is even harder to deal with without Tom's presence. Late at night, Cassie suddenly wakes up and goes out to pee. He does not realize that the survivor quietly appears behind him, threatening his safety. However, Julia arrives in time and attacks the survivor very violently and emotionally. Cassie immediately approached her mother and managed to wean, preventing the situation from getting worse. With her breath still heaving, Julia finally managed to calm down after the stressful incident. The next day, they continued their journey and had to pass through a steep and high cliff of rocks. The landscape around them seemed very different from what they were used to, because what they saw now was the seabed that had dried up as a result of a phenomenon. On the way, Ben, who was very thirsty, suddenly wanted to drink water from a dirty puddle that looked like a comb. However, Julia soon dissuades her, realizing that the water is not safe to drink and could harm Ben's health. Arriving at a location full of sand and many used chairs, Julia and the children gathered some chairs to be used as a place to spend the night. Since Ben had already drunk the dirty water earlier, Julia inevitably had to immediately inject him with antibiotics. At night, Julia suddenly wakes up after hearing a strange sound from outside that makes her adrenaline rise. As he examined the source of the sounds, they became increasingly clear and alarming. When Julia realized that the noises might be a threat to their safety, she immediately returned to her children's place and woke them up. Without wasting time, Julia asked her children to leave immediately, and they immediately ran to save themselves from potential danger. After running far enough to seek help, Julia finally finds a group of others who turn out to be alive. They were 3 survivors who were looking for valuables near the container. However, when Julia asks for help and assistance from them, the 3 survivors actually dodge and choose to hide in one of the containers. They do not care about the state of Julia and her children, who clearly need help. As it turned out, what was chasing Julia and the children all this time was a huge horde of crabs that came from the deep sea. When Julia and the children managed to escape by climbing onto the container, the fate of the 3 survivors who previously refused to help them is reversed. The 3 survivors were trapped in the container because they did not notice the small hole that allowed the crab to enter. They end up falling victim to a ferocious crab attack, while Julia and her children managed to survive aboard the container. Julia was hit by the claws of one of the powerful crabs, causing injuries to her legs. The excruciating pain knocked Julia unconscious instantly, while her children who were nearby panicked and tried to help her. When it dawned, it was morning, and Julia did not see Ben and Cassie on the spot. In a strong wind that blocked the view, Julia tried to find her children. After Ben and Cassie are found, Julia and the children take refuge in a container. They took over some of the survivors' belongings, such as firearms and some other important objects. Meanwhile, Julia uses the gunpowder contained in the bullet to prevent infection from the wound on her leg. After the weather improved, Julia and the children decided to continue the journey. Before that, Julia tried to contact the captain using a satellite phone belonging to the survivors and managed to connect with the surviving captain. When Julia told about the crab attack that injured her, the captain shared a similar experience. He also claimed to have been attacked by a crab last night. According to the captain, the crabs appeared due to hunger, due to the absence of food in the seawater that had dried up. However, another bad news is that the results of the inspection of the captain's tools show that seawater will return faster than originally expected. Instead of waiting for 1 week, the seawater will come in the next few hours. To accurately mark his location, the captain fired a flare gun as a sign that they could find him. After seeing a sign from a flare gun, Julia and the children finally managed to find the captain's submarine, which is not too far away. However, to reach it, they must pass through a narrow gap that surrounds the area. Given that crabs may still roam and pose a threat, Julia must remain alert, ready for a surprise attack as they move towards the submarine. This situation requires them to be careful and move quickly in order to immediately take refuge in the submarine before the situation becomes more dangerous. A new problem arises when the crack in the rocks they are passing suddenly collapses and almost falls on all 3. Luckily, they all managed to survive, but Julia had to be separated from the children after the path they passed was covered by the ruins of the stone. When Cassie and Ben intend to wait and pick up Julia, Julia immediately tells them to go first. She reminded that the main purpose of the trip is to ensure the safety and life of her 2 children. With a heavy heart, Julia assured them that she would follow later. Cassie finally pulls Ben to leave the place immediately in search of safety. Julia wanted to make sure her children could get out of the danger zone as quickly as possible. When Cassie and Ben arrive at the submarine's location, they are greeted by the captain, who looks very weak and was badly injured by a crab attack last night. His condition was very critical, and the captain realized that he would not be able to hold out much longer. With the realization that his life is coming to an end, the captain decides to give his submarine to Cassie and Ben, hoping that they can use it to save themselves and continue their lives safely. Cassie immediately returned to her mother's location to tell about the opportunity to use the submarine. However, the precarious situation resumed when hordes of hungry and aggressive crabs appeared in the place. Julia quickly prepares to deal with this threat and raises her gun to shoot the approaching crabs one by one, trying to protect herself. Fire after fire was carried out with high focus to ensure their safety amid the approaching threat. Just when Julia's bullets run out, Cassie suddenly appears and tells her that there is still one empty seat on the submarine that can save them. Hearing this news, Julia immediately seized the opportunity. He ran towards the stone ruins and managed to climb to a higher place so that he could escape from the ambush of fierce crabs. When Julia and the children arrive at the submarine, the starving crabs still continue to pursue them persistently. Quickly, Julia and the children got into the submarine just at the moment when the seawater began to rise with a huge height. The submarine was immediately hit by a strong wave of seawater, causing severe shaking in the ship. Julia and the children were thrown here and there, unable to maintain balance due to a very strong shock. The situation inside the ship was very chaotic and dangerous until finally they all fainted from the shock. After the severe shock, Julia and the children finally regained consciousness. They found that the seawater had calmed down and returned to normal. With relief, they immediately got out of the submarine and looked around. As it turns out, they have been stranded on land that now looks very different from before. Drastic changes to their surroundings make them realize that their journey has taken them to a completely new and unexpected place. The film ends with a fairly hanging ending, without a detailed explanation of what exactly happened to planet Earth at that time. Is the event that Julia and the children are experiencing just a temporary disaster? Or is it the beginning of a much larger disaster that threatens the future of the planet? This ending is intended to let the audience think further about the possibilities that occur afterwards. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next movie recaps.